start. Okay, I think we can begin. Om Namo Narayana, Ushama, and good evening to those that are streaming in. We want to welcome you to this evening's talk, which is about navigating trauma in children and looking at the mindfulness issues related to that. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Usha Vasthare, who is a devotee of the center and who has been with us in South Africa on a series of talks. Dr. Vasthare, for those of you who have not already known, is a neuroscientist by profession, and she is the founder of the Yogakshema Rehabilitation Center in India, having spent most of her adult life in the US involved in neuroscience. She then started using neuroscience as a means for understanding the mind and mindfulness techniques. And she's been with us for a number of years, conducting mindfulness workshops and talks related to that. Dr. Vasthare is an international speaker and author with television and radio appearances. Sorry about that. And we are very humbled that she is here with us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Shivani Singh. I'm a pediatric critical care specialist by profession, and my other job is chairing the medical wing of the Ramakrishna Clinic of South Africa for the Ramakrishna organization. Based on examples, the talks that we've been speaking about have been on a neuroscience and spiritual basis. So I hope we'll be able to join during the discussion. It's actually going to be a conversation with this. And I think a lot of the topics emerge and navigate into this topic as well. We have discussed over the last few days overcoming the anxious mind. We've been speaking about forgiveness in a violent society. We've had workshops on overcoming depression. We have spoken about mindfulness in chronic illness, and we've been doing a host of talks with Dr. Vasthare on mindfulness and also mental strengthening, if I may call it that, in terms of ensuring a better health for all. So this topic that we have chosen today is something that is not often covered. It is, although it is a very significant topic for our society. And I hope that with this discussion, we can bring awareness to some of the issues in here. And in our advertisements, we've invited not just people of the medical community, but also teachers, parents, aunts and uncles. In fact, anybody who is in the realm of caring for children will have a significant value in learning some of this. Ushama, you know, our society, the South African society, but I think it's not only South African society, I think it's also related to a number of other international countries right now that experience the issue of violence in their society. And when we talk about trauma in children, violence is just one aspect of this that we talk about, but it is very prevalent in our society. And we've had violence in relation to things like even divorce and trauma related to issues of bullying. cyberbullying, and the psychological consequences that get imprinted from that. So I'd like to kick this off by trying to understand, when we talk about trauma in the brain of a child, what actually are we defining as that trauma? Because very often we attribute it either to something like violence, which is physical, or something like that, and yet it could be a very subtle connotation and definition that we haven't actually taken into consideration. So how do you define trauma from that perspective?
Okay. Shivani, before I go into how we define trauma itself, let's just talk about the violence issue that you brought about, and let us see the causes of trauma first, and then I think it will make some sense. We usually think the violence in the society is going to cause so much trauma, at least not in the case of children. Children are clueless about the violence in the society, how the parents look at that violence in the society, and how the parents are reacting to it, responding to it, learning from it, and how they are taking that in at the level of the family. First, at their personal level, at the parents' personal level, and how it gets manifested in the family is more important than violence in the society. There is no direct cause of violence in the society causing trauma in the children. I can assure you that. It's how the parents are working towards that is a reflection of the trauma happens within the child. And also he brought about the issue of divorce. What we know about the research in trauma, yes, divorce does cause trauma, much more than divorce. It is not divorce per se, but what happens before and after the divorce is what might cause trauma in the children. And that is one of the last causes of trauma in the children. So if you take that out, usually the causes is 1 second. It's muted. I'm getting some echo, so we're getting some. Yeah. Coming to the causes, it's mostly much more than the violence in the society and the divorce within the family. It is abuse in the family. It could be physical abuse, it could be emotional abuse, or it could even be sexual abuse in the family with the family members. And also, as much as abuse, neglect, physical neglect, and emotional neglect. This happens even at the stage of babies. Forget about children, because when there is physical neglect, when there is emotional neglect, even a baby is affected. It is traumatic because there is no bonding that happens between the parent or the caregiver and the baby. We don't even think about these issues. These are the major causes of trauma. Again, one more cause that is high on the list is when the mother is treated violently and badly by the father, is what is again top of the list for having childhood trauma itself. So, and one more aspect is if somebody is going through mental health issues, I don't even want to call it mental illness because there's a stigma that is attached. Any kind of mental health issue a person is going through, that we know for a fact causes trauma in children. But with that introduction, let's look at what is trauma. Trauma is a pervasive problem. But what it is, it's results from an exposure to a single incident or a series of incidents or events that are emotionally disturbing, or sometimes it could even be life-threatening, but let us just say emotionally disturbing, which has lasting negative adverse effects on the child. It could be at the physical level, emotional level, psychological level, and even spiritual well-being and spiritual level. This is what is generally defined as trauma. But look at the definition. It could be just a single incident or a series of incidents. And especially when it's a series of incidents that happen, then we term that as traumatic stress on the child. And also these days we use the term adverse childhood experience rather than using trauma, the ACE experiences of a child. So this is the general definition of trauma: a single incident, or when it is happening on a repeated manner, might cause traumatic stress itself in the child. And then coming back to the second part of your question, how does it affect neurologically and at the level of the brain, at the level of the mind, how it gets affected? We know for certain, even before going into how it gets affected at the level of the brain, we know for a fact, even one adverse childhood experience will cause certain physical and mental health issues as an adult. And the statistics, what I have is from US. I couldn't put my finger on the statistics in South Africa. And in US, it says 65% of children will have at least one adverse childhood experience. Look at that. And 40% of children have two or more adverse child experience. This number is mind-boggling. Can we imagine 60% of the children? That means it crosses all socio-economic educational background. It is not just for people who are poor and uneducated. If it has to be 60% of the children going through at least single adverse childhood experience, which will have an effect much later as an adult, it is truly mind-boggling.
No, I think absolutely. And I think those numbers that you've quoted for South Africa would be a gross underestimate because of the lack of stats we have. And I just want to touch on the other interesting thing that you spoke about, that if it's that high a percentage, it's affecting all stratas of society. And with the South African context, even though we're defining it within the family, the children are reared by a sort of communal system. So the entire communal system has an imprint and effect on the child that goes outside of just the nuclear family, where the trauma may be prevalent. And with children that come from a better socioeconomic background, the stresses are obviously different and related more to mental health diseases, substance abuse, and those issues that go through all strata. But they are slight nuances in terms of the they would experience.
Shivani, I'm not able to hear you. I think you have a poor connection. Can you repeat that last sentence again?
Sorry, did I need to? So I think we were just mentioning the fact that the stresses across different types of society, low socioeconomic versus higher socioeconomic backgrounds is what also affects the different types of stresses that affect children in these adverse events.
So, another thing, there is no statistics for this, Shivani, out of my own experience dealing with many different types of people in various different types of cultures. This is just, if you may, it's like personal communication, I'm saying, without any statistical data backed by this. Especially children who get into traumatic experience, certain type of, let us say, certain abuse, especially with the limited cases that I have seen, it usually falls under two extreme conditions. Kids who are extremely bright. So they are naturally curious, you know, they go about exploring things, or kids who are not up to the level of normal development, let us say. They maybe they're slow learners, maybe, or not to the mark, as you would see with other kids. These two extremes are the ones who get affected the most with respect to certain type of abuse, especially with respect to physical abuse or the sexual abuse. These are the two extremes that we see. Apart from that, I need to answer the very first question you talked about, how it affects the brain. Again, we know for a fact that childhood trauma affects different regions of the brain, be it the prefrontal cortex, it could be our limbic system, and it's also, they have looked at development at the corpus callosum level. We will get into each of these regions and then see why each of these is kind of significant for us to understand, you know. Whenever the hippocampus or the amygdala gets affected because of trauma, and there is evidence right now, kids are not able to handle their emotions, even when they become, when they are adults. The emotion regulation is affected. And even if there is danger in the vicinity, sometimes they're not able to figure out and then see that it is kind of a danger that is happening, because they have seen the size of the amygdala is decreased with traumatic experience in kids. Whereas with respect to prefrontal cortex, it is the gray matter. Again, gray matter is reduced in the prefrontal cortex. Again, that shows whether prefrontal cortex is again an important aspect for emotion regulation. That emotion regulation is again affected as they become adults, not just in children. So these adverse effects on the brain in different regions of the brain, it is carried through even in the adult stage. And especially the corpus callosum, which actually connects the right and the left brain, is not as developed even when during the traumatic stage, during childhood. Again, that carries it through as adults. So these are the three major regions that they have seen, and there is evidence that prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and the amygdala of the limbic system, and the corpus callosum being affected. But that is at the neurological level. But what happens for the development of the child itself when there is no emotional bonding, which is so very important with the caregiver, with the parent, how it affects later on in life, not be able to have that intimate relationship as an adult with the partner, with the spouse. And if they have kids, again, it shows, it goes into intergenerational issues. It doesn't stop at one generation. This is the sad part. And I'm glad sometimes you come up with such unique and different topics that I have not dealt with. Sometimes I resist because it is such a deep issue, even sometimes I don't want to get into that. Both this and the conflict resolution that you brought about. Again, if we have to combine these in a normal, healthy human being, maybe as an adult, they will be able to resolve issues much better than children who have gone through traumatic experience and becoming adults. Forget about at the workplace, even at the level of the family, it has an issue. So both that conflict resolution, what we talked about, discussed earlier, and this again has such a strong relationship, Shivani.
So while we're speaking about how the brain is actually getting imprinted, we know from a pediatric development mode that the first year of life is most important in a child's life for emotional bonding. And there are, evidence to show that when that bonding is delayed, it affects the neurodevelopment and more the emotional development in a significant way. So we can understand that if you have a very significant adverse event, there may be immediate and devastating imprinting of the brain. But is there a matter of which these changes can occur more subtly? And at what point do they become more imprinted into the brain? Because as you've spoken about, the generational issues of how people or adults cope with their issues will then factor into how a child then learns and experiences the learned behavior of handling problems, becomes then taken into adulthood, as you mentioned. So is there an entity where this particular part of where we can tell where this imprinting actually takes place, and more to the effect that later on, how do we actually prevent it, or how do we find a pathway or a stop to that pathway that is taking place?
Yeah. Regarding the first question about imprinting, it is not like one time it happens or at a stage. It happens throughout the life, especially when such triggers come about. I'll just give you an example. If a child associates its traumatic experience, let us say, with some smell, if there is physical abuse, let us say, either to the child or to the mother, and let's say the father is alcoholic, let us say, and then such a thing happens, and then the child in its memory can smell the alcohol, and also maybe the cologne that the father is wearing, those two smells will trigger as an adult, and the same experience is relived. Again, this is because of the law of association, as we know. So I don't think there is any research that has shown when and how it gets imprinted. It is hard to go into such studies. And personally, if you ask me, rather than going into such research studies, we need to be focusing on how do we prevent, first of all, and when it happens, how to overcome. So we will talk about both prevention and how to overcome. We will take up how to overcome first and then think about the prevention. How to overcome now. WHO has come up with many training materials for school age going kids for different countries, if I'm correct. So WHO has realized, and then we need to look into that. I have not looked into those teaching materials and the training materials that are there, and it has to be different based on the culture. We cannot have one size fits all for all different cultures and different ages. So officials, people have realized, and things are happening as to how to overcome after the fact. And at an individual level, how do we overcome that? I will go into that little bit more detail later, because this is where the issue of neuroplasticity comes into the being. So we will get to the overcoming at an individual level. We will take that up as a separate issue. But regarding prevention, it's only through education. And in my opinion, nothing else but education and the right kind of support. Again, see, it's a vicious cycle, Shivani. If any parent, not necessarily, I'm just saying it is the father who does the abuse, it can be either one. If that parent has been abused as a child, it continues, and they don't even realize it is abuse. They don't even realize what kind of an effect it will have on the child, what kind of an effect it has had on themselves. So the awareness and the education aspect, even for adults for that matter, we have to start from the adult level. And that is where meetings like this is going to be immensely helpful. We won't even realize it right now as we go along. When people get to see this, this is where this becomes an awareness issue, to be honest with you. Because as I said, irrespective of socioeconomic education background, when I see the adults going through and then show them how, not about blaming their parents, pinpointing problems with the parents or anybody, but just to be aware of what has happened, and it is their responsibility to overcome. In a similar manner, we would never have thought about it this way, Shivani. Even in families which are very, very religious, children get into the traumatic experience of making kids do certain things because of the parental problems. The parents, because of the fear of God. This is where I keep honing on this and stressing on this. We really need to get into understanding what God is, who God is, so that that fear factor will go away. Rather than the fear factor, it has to be the love for God, which will reflect in love for people. If there is fear of God, it will also reflect as fear of people, What I have come across in many adults coming from a highly religious background, they're made to do certain things without understanding. When they do it, they get into that fearful mode of doing certain of the religious practices at home. This results in many of the mental health issues. It could be anxiety, it could be depression, bipolar, and especially OCD and repetitive thinking. And the mildest version of all of this, Shivani, this is what I see in adults. It is that controlling nature and controlling behavior. We don't see these things in medical textbooks because of experience. What I have seen with adults, I'm trying to connect the dots and understand. As simple as controlling others or controlling the situation outside. Things have to be kept in a certain way, not in any other way. Cleaning up the place too much, it doesn't have to go into the level of clinical OCD, but many of the things get manifested. And I have seen in religious families, kids have repetitive thinking and then compulsive actions, OCD in both kids and adults. When they become adults, this is what we are realizing. One of the issues is again comes because of the fear factor induced by the parents and grandparents towards God. Again, I'm not blaming any parent or grandparent. Now, as adults, we need to recognize this and be able to understand from a much broader and bigger picture. This is my personal take on this.
Okay, so I just want to go back to when we speak about how the trauma, the adverse event or trauma gets imprinted into the brain. And I know that we've spoken in the past a lot about the negative, the ants, the automatic negative thoughts that get imprinted into the child. So how would an adverse event then in a child be then imprinted? Not often by the repetition of the trauma, so not just by the action itself, but there probably is some memory going into that. So maybe you can take us through understanding how something gets embedded into the mind of a child in that way, to understand better how we can then prevent that pathway from taking place.
Yeah. Even before going there with children, Shivani, before getting into the automatic negative thoughts and feelings that happen at a much later stage, neurologically, the kids are affected. Either pruning of neurons or the connections of neurons that has to happen in the normal child's development stage, first that gets affected. When there is not proper pruning of the neurons, and when there is not proper connections of neurons, and especially with the corpus callosum being affected, it starts first at a neurological level, and then it comes later on at the level of the mind itself, wherein, see, it is like kid being always on high alert. Of course, the kids like the ambulance when or the fire trucks, the kids get excited to hear the siren going and whatnot. But imagine it is a fire alarm that is happening within the brain of the child for every little thing, because the amygdala gets activated so much and there is dysregulation. Happens because of even the prefrontal cortex being affected. The child is always on alert. This is what becomes that chronic traumatic stress. They don't just call it stress. Chronic stress is different. Chronic traumatic stress is different, because chronic stress might first will affect first at the, let us say, physical level. And if they do not know how to cope with that, and usually people do not know how to cope with that, also affects the mental level. Here, it first affects neurologically, and it will definitely affect even before at the level of the mind, at the behavior level with the children. The automatic negative thoughts and all of that come much later, which will happen as adults. But with kids, this is what we need to be concerned. Sometimes there might be permanent damage that happens. However, things, I don't want to make it as hopeless as it's already been, but it's always hopeful, We know that the brain is not set on stone. We can actually mold the brain to become resilient. So as the child grows up, if it can come across with the help of course, the parents or other adults, certain coping skills, certain coping mechanisms, the child can learn to become resilient. Because everything we're talking about, Shivani, even though it might happen to many, many kids, only a certain number of kids get affected, right? Even in the same house, sometimes one kid might look at the situation or face a situation and adversely, the other kid might be able to handle that. It could be for many different reasons, and one of the reasons is also genetic influence of how a child can be resilient. There are certain genes that are responsible for certain people being more resilient than others. But of course, we are not just talking about just the genes. This is where we go into the epigenetic level, right? It's a debate between nurture and nature. So even though there is some genetic influence, we can overcome that by developing proper coping skills. If the child has an adult, it could be a parent, it could be anybody, or a role model, to take it through to help build the resilience by giving positive stress. It could be how to take a test in the school, or about public speaking. It's not just an event about public speaking. The same rewiring of the brain can be used in other situations too, you know. This is where, especially in West, through sports, they help the kids to build resilience. And that is one of the best ways. And then we actually met somebody the other day in the workshop who's a cricket coach, and she's doing exactly this with the children. Maybe we should have had her also on the panel. We would have learned a lot. Maybe the next time we can do that.
So, you know, I think the presentation of this and the recognition of this becomes so myriad. And that's why, you know, it's important for teachers, because that's usually when the episodes are actually initially detected. And from a medical point of view, other organic results of this, with some chronic headaches, or something that chronic headaches or bedwetting, some of the actual organic manifestations that children have, that, you know, seeks out a psychological issue that they're having. And is there a matter of which predicts how things are going to be presenting, or is it just the nature of the child that affects that? Where you either see aggression or apathy that is the same, that may have the same common factor in a child, but presenting in a very different manifest ways. So it makes it even more difficult to detect these things happening unless you're dealing with things like bullying, aggression, and those sort of louder issues, whereas the quieter ones tend not to get recognized. But I think you know, those manifestations are so myriad that it's important for people to be aware that one presentation doesn't apply to all children.
True. That's so true. What we know of is from research from quite some time back, but we also need to look at what's happening in the present day and age, which is what you usually don't see these in medical textbooks, right? Especially the influence of digital media, and then addiction to technology, and risk-taking with teenage children is one of the major issues because of childhood trauma, and developing eating disorders, and they have self-harming behaviors. This usually happens with preteens and teens especially, and they become sexually active at a lot younger age than otherwise. And especially the risk-taking behavior is a major issue with teenagers. And that is why many a times you will also see other issues associated with such risk-taking behaviors, which is again directly proportional to getting into social media addiction, technology addiction, even alcohol addiction in teenagers. Many of the issues, usually you can see it is correlated with childhood trauma. But as you rightly said, with very young kids, because of the fear factor that is involved with the young preschool children, especially bedwetting is one of the major issues. However, many children who are very sensitive, they also do bedwetting when they are young. So this is where it is kind of confusing, and we need to be very careful just talking about some of the effects or the symptoms in kids, both in normal kids and kids who have had traumatic experience. Normal kids who are highly sensitive, they will have similar effects. So much more than in seeing with just children, it clearly shows as adults. This is where many a times we don't talk about the effect of childhood trauma on the adults. We take issues just with the children and then work on that. However, the largest research study that was done in US, what they call it as ACE study, they looked at literally thousands and thousands of adults, and they have seen, and it's also probably a longitudinal study, if I'm correct, they have seen a clear-cut correlation between childhood trauma and many of the diseases like heart, cardiovascular diseases, depression, anxiety, people getting into addictions. Anxiety and depression are the major issues, and there is clear-cut evidence shown because of the childhood trauma. So it becomes much more complicated. Even though we are talking mostly about the kids, we have to be even more concerned. This is what it shows in adults, and it goes unnoticed, if not for that ACE study, that adverse childhood experience study, one of the largest research studies that were done, we would not have known the direct correlation and the direct effect of childhood trauma on adults. And it happens at many different levels and stages also. As simple as not having the right relationship with other adults and their spouses, starting from that to controlling behavior and whatnot.
So if we had to talk about how you can now go through dealing with an adverse event, so there are two arms to this. So let's just first talk about when there's an acute event that has occurred. In medical terms, we talk about debriefing. When we find an adverse event that's happening, and you actually have to discuss the whole event then. So when you have the acute situation where there is something detected or something has been found to be an adverse event, what are the steps or the methods then that can be instituted by a parent, a provider, a teacher to assist them to decrease the effect of that adverse episode?
Great question. I would like to know what happens here in the system, maybe I would like to know, because every country, it is different. And I will tell you what it is if you want to go ahead, and then let me know how it is dealt with acutely and chronically. I don't know how the system works here. And of course, it depends on the age of the child. Let's say it's a school going child, and then how do you deal with this? At least in in US, depending on the case, even the social worker intervenes, but I would like to know how it is dealt with in this culture, Shivani.
Yeah. So you're correct. I think once a problem is acutely detected, if there is a medical manifestation of the problem, then they have to be seen by a medical professional or a pediatrician in order to rule out an organic cause before you can directly relate it to the adverse condition. And then once that's done, or in conjunction with that, you would have the social worker that is usually the person getting involved before even a psychologist gets involved. So the social worker in many instances actually functions also as a psychologist. And it's only when they determine that they need psychological help that it would go on. So that's largely for most of the patients in the public sector that would work. And I think that the same sort of aspects are available to those in private, in the private health system, but they would have easier access to a psychologist and earlier access to a psychologist. So for most of the patients, or the majority of the patients that we see, the social worker would probably be the first line of contact outside of the medical professional to intervene in the problem.
Usually what I see, the people who come to me, is usually not as acutely as you would think, usually after the fact, when they have seen certain things, either the parents bring them, or I see most of them as adults, But if it does happen acutely, or even if they are talking about it and they're reliving that experience, the first thing is to develop that trust, and not just with the professional, but also within the family itself. And they need that support within that family. And so that trust has to be built, especially with a child, with the parents and whatnot. Sometimes that trauma may not be within the family. It happens even at the level of their friends. In the school, it happens. A trauma can happen in the school, especially when they are teenagers, pre-teens, and that is where many of the things they pick up, especially in these days, everything is about the peer pressure, right? So they get involved with the peer pressure, and they do certain things, or they get involved in certain things that they should not. Without their knowledge, it goes little too far. And then that is when either the parent will know, or the teacher, or the counselor at school, and then things happen. So the first and foremost is accepting them unconditionally, and to help them how they need to both forgive themselves and forgive the other person. That forgiveness aspect is so important. I cannot stress this fact anymore. Irrespective of what age, we need to bring in that forgiveness aspect. Even for a child, for an adult, for a teenager, it doesn't matter. Because it's the forgiveness is for that person. It's not that somebody else has wronged. Otherwise, they will not be able to move forward in their life to have a better future. To have a future, a different future, one needs to forgive. They cannot change the past, but they can certainly change the future by starting to forgive. But we cannot force anybody to forgive. It will have even adverse effect. So everything is about helping the child understand at a cognitive level and give them tools and techniques that will work not just at the cognitive level, but at a deeper level too, spiritual level, if you may, emotional level. Tools, we should think about many different things, but whatever age they are in, to be able to make them understand whether it's the importance of forgiveness or the importance of overcoming this through neuroplasticity. I was talking about how at an individual level, we can bring in the principles of neuroplasticity and give them full hope for the child to be able to change themselves, because neuroplasticity is such a powerful tool, such an empowering tool, but nobody else can do it. Nobody can help the child or an adult for that matter. They have to put this into practice by themselves. So to be able to convince them, we need to use logic, we need to use all different ways for them to be convinced about it. So even though it seems so hopeless with all that great statistics, we really need to know there is hope. Certainly there is hope. Combining forgiveness and the principles of neuroplasticity, especially when it comes to an adult stage, they can use these tools and techniques to be able to overcome. But the person has to be ready. Still, there is so much stigma attached. It is really, really hard for the people or for the family to come through. As we're speaking, I'm in contact with many different families in different nations for that matter. And it is still so hard. And we just, as professionals, we just have to wait for them to keep building that trust, to keep building that rapport, so that they will truly open up, and they have to be ready for this. Even if that stigma is taken away, that individual stigma is, even if that is taken away, then it takes a lot of time for them to be really ready to come out, because the brain is wired to these incidents so much. It takes a lot of effort to come out of this. So the brain wants to be very, very cost effective in terms of energy. When you have to put in so much effort, it does take a lot more energy for the brain, and the brain's function is to conserve the energy. So it takes the path of least resistance, and even the person gets used to it, and either to go into that vicious cycle. And it's hard for people to come out of that victim state of mind, whether a child or an adult. So to make them understand that they need to come out of that victim state of mind, that is the first step. Yes, truly they are victims, but they don't have to stay victims for the rest of their lives. This is the first and foremost message.
Okay, so that would be more applicable for the older child, probably the adolescent or teen child that you're going to have. You've spoken about the neuroplasticity and the tools that can be used. So if this now continues on a chronic basis, what are some of the neuroplasticity tools that can be used in children of all ages. A therapist would tend to use play therapy initially in a certain age group, going on to other activities in the older age group. So perhaps we can share some factors or tools that people can be using to start implementing this, the neuroplasticity, and to prevent that entrenchment of the adverse event.
First and foremost for a child is to have a role model, somebody at home who, or outside for that matter, it doesn't matter, to help build resilience in these children. The how to will be many, because even such young children, because of being in the victim mode, they do not realize, and neither do the adults, the kid will start looking at things as black and white. That is the first and foremost, to make kids understand that they, and us as adults, to help kids see that things should not be looked at as black and white, but many different possibilities waiting to happen, and then there are many different ways of dealing with the situation itself. Most of the things come about because we look at things from the binary format. That's why I keep going back to religious people, how this is so closely connected. When I use the religion, we have to be very careful here. I want to define this, not getting into misunderstanding in this statement itself. When I say religious attitude, it's not that not believing in God is irreligious. Religion is just saying only my God is the one, or there is salvation only with my God, no other gods. Having such rigid understanding of religion is what right now I'm defining that as religious people. Even in their own faith, they will not get into any other God. That kind of rigid religious attitude I'm talking about. So I'm glad I want to make this clear. Otherwise, we are all religious people in the much broader sense, but I'm talking about the religious people who are very, very fixed mindsets, thinking only one God, and not one God. My God is the one who is going to give salvation. Again, nothing wrong in believing. That is everybody's prerogative, and everybody has a right. But if it is affecting their own health and the kids' health and the health of the society for that matter, somewhere we need to broaden this view. That is all I'm trying to say. So coming back, such religious fixed, rigid mindset people will look at things only with two options, right or wrong, black and white, good and evil. Just expanding that view itself is again the beginning. We need to figure out, depending on the culture, depending on the age, various different ways how we can introduce this to the kids. And definitely having that role model is very, very important. What we're talking about, neuroplasticity, is a big term. We don't even have to go there. These are all resilience building tools. And as a kid is building up that resilience, it has to honestly learn and enjoy the process. Not as a treatment, it has to enjoy. Then only it becomes second nature as it goes, becomes an adult. That's why I would like to call this as resilient building tools rather than just rewiring tools and as a treatment.
Okay, so if we had to let's go through an example, for instance. So if a teacher or a parent has a child that is being bullied, and there are actually two elements to this, because the child who is the bully would need this as much as the child who is being bullied. What would your strategy be to address those two scenarios? One scenario, but the two situations that you're going to help. And what would you actually tell the child? So let's say that the child is, 10 years old. What would you actually tell the child so that the child's understanding and experience of what is happening changes?
This is a tough question, Shivani, and so broad. It is going to be really hard to generalize, but much more than the kids. First, we need to go to the parents and then bring up this issue. Why did this come about? As you rightly said, the kid who is bullying, that kid needs to be taught how to handle the situation and why is this happening. And if you take that kid who is bullying and then say not give advice, not give do's and don'ts, none of that, to take that kid who's bullying and try to understand that kid, that kid itself will give us the answers why he or she is doing and how we can help that kid. To be honest with you, I have dealt with a very short term, one or two kids like that in a group. And mostly it is again because of some issue that is happening within the family, that kid is not able to face that issue, do not know how to deal with that, is what is making that kid to bully against others. So I think we need to focus on the kid first who is bullying rather than the kid who is being bullied upon. This is my take on that issue. And if you really build that rapport, that kid will open up and say, rather than giving that advice and do's and don'ts, none of that. I want to understand what is happening in my life. You can take me into confidence. And we have to make sure that kid is not going to get punished. If that kid is going to get punished after this initial talk, it will continue. It will be worse. We need to bring in that kindness, compassion, and love. Without that, it is not going to be possible. But usually this takes a lot of time, as you know, and it is slow process.
Yes.
Punishing the child is much quicker, even though it does not help. And then the kid becomes an adult and it will have issues within the family, not even others.
Yeah. And what would you say to the one that is being bullied?
Again, to say that the other kids need help. We're going to try and figure out ways and means how to help that kid. But until then, we need to protect that kid who is being bullied, whichever way it is possible, and try and see if it can be addressed in a kind, compassionate manner, as much as also helping that kid to build up more of confidence. And usually it is the physically weaker child is the one that gets bullied upon, that we see that. And to bring in a lot of compassion to make that kid understand it's the other kid who is at fault and not you. Even at that young age, it is even much easier. And then even before getting bullied, this kid can help the other kid also, if it is possible, I always look at the positive effect and then to try and see how to bring harmony even there, rather than just pinpointing fingers and then blaming the situation and the kid. As much as possible, we need to do. This is where, for me, I like Dalai Lama's statement. He says, my religion is very simple, and that is kindness. And be kind whenever you can. And you can be kind, he says.
Well, I think in my experience of my practice, I think one of the great lessons from children is their adaptability in some of the worst situations, and their recovery in going through that. Even without the support or change in the environment, there's an inherent adaptability in children that obviously gets lost in adults and becomes more fixed and entrenched in adults. That becomes more apparent as you grow older. And one of the things that you mentioned was that, forgiveness was a big aspect of this. So yes, for the adult, I can understand the forgiveness of the issues related to them in the adulthood that would have childhood origins. But very often children are extremely forgiving. And where do you draw the line in terms of the safety issues with the forgiveness? And when can you actually start with the forgiveness in children to ensure that that safety is not abused?
Yeah, we have a lot of misconceptions about forgiveness, Shivani. When I say forgiveness is important, that does not mean there should be reconciliation. Absolutely not. That forgiveness is done for that kid, not for neither the adult or anybody else. Those two are separate issues. Even these, just so how the kids can understand it is possible. In fact, from the organization that we had, Yogakshema, that I belong to, we have helped certain kids. I think they're preteens and teenagers all over India. This group of kids were at a summer camp in Bangalore, an institute called NIMHANS, National Institute of Mental Health Sciences. For such group of diverse kids from all over India, our volunteers went and talked about forgiveness just through storytelling and playing some games, So the kids, as you rightly said, they're so resilient, they're so forgiving, but their understanding of forgiveness is very different. It's not about the kid's understanding of forgiveness I'm talking about. The kid will think, if I forgive, then I have to go and be with that person or another friend or an adult. Absolutely not. I'm talking about from a scientific perspective, from the perspective of based on recent advances in neuroscience research, then it has nothing to do with reconciliation as you're talking about. If that happens, that is great. But reconciliation is not the issue here. The kid will understand it has to forgive, but still stay away from the perpetrators. And not only stay away, it will have that courage to go talk to other elders and other adults at the right time. Because of the fear factor, the perpetrator, it could be parent, whoever it is, they're so afraid and they won't even go tell somebody else, even within the family. So especially with the trauma experience, and the child will develop that courage to be able to.
So, we concentrated on a lot of the heavy and the serious aspects of trauma. Are the other more subtle things that adults do that create adverse events in children. You know, we know the abuse and all of that, but very often a lot of the psychological issues related to self-esteem don't really come from that obvious abuse. So what can some of the I think we're going to cover it in time to come, but in terms of parenting or teaching skills, can people be aware of that may be causing these adverse events? You know, unfortunately, our school system has not progressed to beyond the competitive intellectual strata. And that aspect is still there. So I wanted to just end this by giving adults some hand in how to elevate children that they may not have been aware of before, because so often we unconsciously say or do things that have lasting effects on children without us even knowing it.
That's a great question again, Shivani, and it's a segue for the tomorrow's interactive session with Dr. Charlene on mindful parenting, as a matter of fact. Especially Indian parents, or parents probably, you have to say of Indian origin here. And I know even in West, parents of Indian origin and Indian parents, at least I'm talking about my generation and maybe a couple of generations later. They had a way of motivating their kids by comparing. The reason I say this, motivating the kids, is none of the parents will will wish anything bad to their kids, but without their knowledge, that is the way they knew how, because that is how they were brought up, right? Without their knowledge, they have picked up motivating their kids by comparing with their siblings and with their friends, with their neighbors, whoever it is, you know. That is one major reason. But the culture has changed. Forget about the parents. The kids themselves realize that comparison is not a good one. So the culture has changed, and we are evolving as human beings in this society. At that stage, whatever, 50, 60 years back, it worked. That is fine. The same strategy may not work in a healthy manner if we use the same system. Motivating the kids is very important, but how we motivate, we need to learn as educators, we need to learn as parents. We need to keep the values of motivating our kids, but how that has to change. If that has to change, we as educators, we as medical professionals, we as parents need to learn. All it is happening, Shivani, the way I see the big picture, you know, at a very meta level, each and every one of us, does not matter whether you're a parent or a grandparent or a child, we need to become lifelong learners. Until and unless we keep up with this technology or anything that is happening, or in the AI world, it is impossible for us to keep up, both in educating and bringing up the children with values, and even to love them. If we just try to love them the way we did, because I always believe love is also in action, right? If we just use certain of the actions that we were brought up with, it may not work with all the kids. So even as parents and as grandparents, we need to figure out what ticks, what will help with the child based on our socioeconomic educational background. So that comparison, actually, if we stop at the educators level and the parents level, it does great justice. However, comparison is good. We need to make sure that a mirror has to be our comparison. We need to compare with ourselves, how I was the year before, how I was the month before, the day before, and the moment before. So
I think that leads to one of the questions that's on the chat, also a big question. How can we guide a child to be kind, compassionate, and forgiving, but still standing firm with boundaries, preparing the child for adulthood?
Great question. Simple answer: by being kind, by being compassionate, by living with borders for ourselves as parents. If we do that, they say values are not taught, they're caught, right? So whatever we do as educators, whatever we do as parents, that is what the kids learn. If we do one thing and then ask our kids to do something else, that stage is over. It's at my stage, it could have happened, but not anymore, which is again a hopeful thing for me. It's about the parents being constant learners and to enjoy the parenting, educators enjoying the process and not just repeating whatever they have learned in their student days and keep repeating, And to be honest with you, as much as we talk about these issues and challenges and problems, I also come across people who are highly hopeful and then leading lives with so much positivity, bringing up their kids. And the educators, look how resilient they were during pandemic times. Even such elderly teachers in their 50s and 60s learned to use technology, to be able to teach the kids. Because just recently, even during pandemic and post-pandemic also, we are trying through Yogakshema, we are trying to train principals of schools all over India and to train teachers all over India to become neurosculptors, to bring in all these neuroscience concepts. So they are so resilient and so eager to learn. We also need to focus on those sides.
Yes, definitely. I think if people became as little children, we would be having a lot less problems. And, one of the things we always tell parents is that a child requires mostly attention and love. That you're sitting by the bedside.
Come again, Shivani. Attention and love is what the kid needs, and then we lost you.
Yeah, attention and love is needed, and oftentimes we find that mostly happening only when a child is ill, that they're getting that undivided attention. So I think the attention to a child's condition and state of mind becomes very important in any sort of situation dealing with children, not only from a parental point of view, but any caregiver that has the responsibility of having children in their care. I don't know if there are any other questions that the participants wish to ask, or comments. Experiences also is the best learning tool. All right, I think we have covered most things, and I think it has opened up an even bigger box of things to look at. Mm-hmm. And I find it an incredibly fascinating topic of being able to mold minds in a certain way, especially if they are children. So I want to thank you very much for experience and enhancing the tools that will serve So thank you, Ushama, for your contribution and the discussion today. And thank you to the participants for being with us. If there's anything further, please, you can let us know how we can assist you in helping children. And if you need any queries, please contact the Ramakrishna Center of South Africa, Durban, and the email and telephone numbers are on the invitations that have been sent out. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Have a good evening.